The night Rome first saw Sporus in bridal robes was not a wedding, but a wound carved into history. Torches lit the streets in gold, their smoke curling into the night air as musicians played a grotesque parody of joy. At the center of the spectacle walked a boy, no older than 14, his body mutilated, his voice forever stolen. Castrated by order of the emperor himself, he was forced into the role of a bride. And not just any bride, but the bride of Nero, the most infamous ruler the empire had ever endured. The crowd roared with drunken laughter and scattered petals that stank of decay. Some clapped to please the emperor, others kept their heads bowed, knowing that silence meant survival. Sporus's eyes, hollow and unblinking, betrayed the truth. This was not marriage, but captivity dressed as ceremony. His body had been transformed into an ornament for a man's obsession, paraded before the empire as if humiliation itself were an art form. This was no rumor whispered in back alleys. Ancient historians recorded it with horror. For Nero's Rome, cruelty was not hidden. It was flaunted. Pleasure and pain merged in rituals that mocked the very idea of humanity. The most horrific sexual practices of Nero the Insane were not accidents of power, but performances meant to burn themselves into the memory of Rome. But Sporus was only one victim in a reign of nightmares, where absolute power twisted into obsessions that still chill the blood today. History hides its darkest truths in shadows, and together we're unearthing them. If this glimpse already unsettles you, subscribe to the channel and join our community of truth seekers. Comment below where you're listening from. Voices from every corner of the world remind us that curiosity unites us across centuries. Your support fuels the uncovering of hidden scandals, forgotten victims, and the secrets that textbooks dare not mention. Stay with us, because what lies ahead in Nero's story is darker, stranger, and more haunting than you could ever imagine. Nero was not born a monster. At first, he was a child wrapped in promise, a boy groomed for greatness in a city that worshipped power and spectacle. His full name, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, did not hint at destiny. But his mother, Agrippina the Younger, one of the most ambitious and ruthless women in Roman history, had other plans. When her husband died, Agrippina maneuvered her way back into the imperial court. She seduced the aging Emperor Claudius into marrying her, and through cunning schemes ensured her son was adopted as heir. With this act, the young Nero was placed directly on the path to the throne, ahead of Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. Tutored by the philosopher Seneca, Nero's early years seemed to promise a golden age. He learned music, poetry, and rhetoric. Rome dreamed of a ruler who would balance the sword with the lyre, power with culture. When Claudius mysteriously died, many suspected poison prepared by Agrippina. The teenager Nero ascended the throne. He was only 16. At first, the empire adored him. He cut taxes, sponsored games, and positioned himself as a friend to the common people. His speeches, crafted by Seneca, painted him as a philosopher king. But behind the veil of promise lurked darker forces. Agrippina hovered at his side, domineering and suffocating. She had not secured the throne for her son alone. She believed the empire belonged to them both. Whispers began almost immediately. The closeness of mother and son troubled even jaded Romans. They dined together in private chambers, walked arm in arm, and were rumored to share a bed. Some accounts suggest that Agrippina used her beauty, still striking in her 30s, to bind her son to her will. Whether true or not, the suspicion of incest clung to Nero's name like smoke. As Nero grew older, he sought freedom from his mother's shadow. He fell in love with Poppaea Sabina, a married woman of dazzling charm, and wanted to marry her. Agrippina opposed it bitterly. Their quarrels escalated until the young emperor, in a desperate act of defiance, ordered her death. According to ancient sources, he first tried poison, then collapsing ceilings, and finally a sabotaged boat. When all failed, he resorted to brute force, sending assassins to stab her in her villa. It was more than matricide. It was a symbolic killing of restraint, morality, and the last thread of human control in Nero's mind. With Agrippina's blood staining his reign, he was now free, but also cursed. Rome shuddered, and Nero himself was haunted. For years afterward, he claimed to see his mother's ghost, pale and accusing, rising from shadows. This was the turning point. The young poet-emperor who once dreamed of art and harmony had crossed a threshold. His conscience fractured, his paranoia deepened, and with no one left to restrain him, his private desires would begin to bleed into public life. Rome was about to witness horrors it had never imagined. The emperor who played the lyre would soon orchestrate tragedies in the bedroom, the palace, and the streets. Every victim became a stage prop, every act of cruelty a performance. And the world would remember him not for poetry, but for the monstrous shadows of his desire. The empire had seen cruel rulers before. Caligula had turned Rome into his theater of madness. Tiberius had retreated to Capri, surrounding himself with boys and brutal pleasures. But Nero's reign took Rome into uncharted territory, not simply because of his cruelty, but because he performed it before the eyes of the world, as if humiliation itself were art. The death of Agrippina did not erase the rumors, it magnified them. Romans whispered that Nero's relationship with his mother had been more than maternal. Some claimed he had openly kissed her mouth, lingered with touches that went far beyond the affection of a son. Others suggested that Agrippina herself flaunted her beauty, reclining beside him at feasts in low-cut gowns, daring anyone to speak. Even if the truth cannot be fully known, the perception was enough. Incest was the most damning accusation in Roman society, and the stain of it never left him. Killing his mother did not silence suspicion. It confirmed it. For every Roman watching, Nero became the man who had violated the natural order, a son who had desired his mother, then destroyed her. The whispers followed him into the palace and the streets, feeding his paranoia and deepening his need to shock the world with acts even more outrageous. If Agrippina's death symbolized the murder of restraint, then Sporus's mutilation revealed what restraint had been keeping back. The boy was young, delicate, and by every account strikingly beautiful. Nero saw in him the image of Poppaea Sabina, the wife he adored but had destroyed. In a fit of rage years earlier, Nero had kicked Poppaea while she was pregnant, crushing both her and their unborn child. The horror of that moment never left him, and in Sporus he sought to resurrect her. But resurrection came at a price. Sporus was castrated, his body altered so he could never become a man. Nero dressed him in bridal robes, veils of gold and silk, and held a mock wedding ceremony. The emperor himself played the role of groom. The boy's humiliation was complete when Nero paraded him before Rome as his empress. Ancient historians tell us the crowds laughed, clapped, even cheered, for to do otherwise was treason. But beneath the noise lay horror. A child had been mutilated and enslaved to fill the void left by Nero's own violence. The cruelty did not end with the wedding. Sporus was forced to live as Poppaea reborn, accompanying Nero in public, sitting beside him at games, enduring whispers and jeers. To Rome, he was the mockery of a woman, a living joke. To Nero, he was an ornament of grief twisted into obsession. Nero's obsession with performance seeped into his private pleasures. He saw himself not only as emperor, but as artist, actor, and god. The boundaries between theater and reality blurred. What others might have hidden behind palace walls, Nero turned into public spectacle. Banquets in the imperial palace became stages of humiliation. Senators and nobles were forced to attend, stripped of dignity, and made to watch the emperor indulge himself with whomever he pleased. Women of high birth were dragged into the chambers, their protests silenced by the emperor's guards. Men, too, were not spared. Slaves, attendants, even nobles humiliated in front of peers. Nero demanded not intimacy but submission. The body, in his eyes, was not a partner, but a stage prop. There are accounts of Nero disguising himself in animal skins during feasts. He would crawl on all fours, roaring like a beast, and attack men and women bound to stakes, biting and clawing as if reenacting some grotesque myth. Laughter filled the halls, but behind the laughter was fear. Who dared resist when the emperor himself demanded obedience? What made Nero unique was not merely his cruelty, but his audacity. He turned the entire city into his playground. Streets became stages for his debaucheries. Public baths, once a place of relaxation, were invaded by the emperor and his entourage, who transformed them into arenas of forced pleasures. Slaves whispered stories of being taken from their beds in the night, marched to the palace, and thrust into Nero's games. Married women lived in terror, for the emperor saw no boundary he could not cross. If he desired a wife, her husband had no say. Refusal was unthinkable. Rome itself seemed paralyzed. The Senate, the generals, the people, all silenced by fear. One historian remarked that the city became his brothel. This was no exaggeration. The palace was no longer the seat of government, but the stage of one man's fantasies. And every citizen, whether slave or noble, lived with the knowledge that they too might be cast into his performance. Behind every act lay the same pattern: obsession, possession, and destruction. Nero destroyed Poppaea in rage, then tried to resurrect her in Sporus. He longed for art and beauty, but turned both into weapons of humiliation. He sought love, but only knew control. Each desire curdled into violence, each pleasure into a nightmare. The Romans, jaded by generations of emperors, had seen excess before, but with Nero it became unbearable because it was flaunted. He demanded not only obedience, but complicity. The crowd must cheer, the Senate must applaud, the empire itself must play along. In his Rome, silence was survival, laughter was submission, and shame became a form of currency. The young boy mutilated into a bride, the nobles forced into mockery, the women paraded as spoils of lust. These were not accidents. They were rituals, rehearsed and repeated, spectacles staged by an emperor who saw himself not as ruler, but as performer. And in this theater of degradation, every victim became part of his script. But this was only the beginning. The horrors would escalate beyond private humiliation. Soon, the emperor's fantasies would spill into blood, cruelty, and public acts so grotesque that Rome itself would tremble. The spiral did not stop with Sporus. What began as whispers of incest and a mock wedding soon exploded into spectacles of cruelty that blurred the line between performance and torture. For Nero, nothing was too extreme, nothing was sacred. Pleasure was not pleasure unless it was soaked in humiliation, ritual, and fear. Ancient sources describe scenes that still rattle the imagination. Nero, obsessed with theater and myth, often dressed in animal skins: panther, boar, even lion. Servants, both men and women, were bound to stakes in dark chambers. Before audiences of drunk nobles and trembling slaves, the emperor would pounce on his victims, biting, tearing at flesh, and simulating savage assault. This was no private indulgence. It was performance art of degradation. He called it playing Hercules, or enacting the passion of the gods. But there was nothing divine in the cries that echoed through the palace halls. There was only submission. The emperor as beast, the victim as prey, and Rome's elite forced to watch in silence, knowing that any grimace, any refusal to laugh, could cost them their lives. Sex, for Nero, was inseparable from violence. He staged encounters where attendants were whipped before the act, their backs bloodied as prelude to his embrace. Some accounts speak of women forced to witness their husband's humiliation, compelled to laugh as their dignity was stripped away. Punishment and desire became indistinguishable. Prisoners condemned for crimes found themselves dragged not to execution but to Nero's chamber, where death was delayed until the emperor had used their bodies for his grotesque games. These were not hidden sins. They were rehearsed spectacles, repeated until cruelty itself became routine. Nero's paranoia about lineage shaped some of his strangest fixations. After killing Poppaea in a fit of rage while she was pregnant, he seemed obsessed with the image of pregnancy, birth, and deformity. Sources suggest he derived a sick fascination from watching pregnant women in pain, demanding attendants describe the agony of childbirth, sometimes forcing interventions that were less medical than cruel. Rome whispered that he surrounded himself with astrologers and quacks who claimed they could guarantee him heirs, yet his cruelty betrayed his fear. He destroyed the life within Poppaea, then tried to conjure her ghost in Sporus. The emperor's need to control creation itself revealed a mind at war with nature, forever twisting life into spectacle. There was another grotesque paradox in Nero's chambers: the clash of beauty and rot. The emperor bathed in exotic oils, cinnamon, saffron, and rose. He demanded halls drenched in perfume, fountains flowing with wine, and petals raining down from ceilings during feasts. Yet beneath the fragrances lingered the iron smell of blood and the stench of bodies broken by his games. One historian wrote that guests sometimes suffocated under the weight of roses poured upon them from above, drowning in petals meant to symbolize love. In Nero's Rome, even beauty could kill. Scents and silk masked horror, but could not erase it. The palace reeked of contradiction, sweetness hiding rot, desire hiding cruelty. What made Nero's debaucheries unbearable was not only their grotesque nature, but the way they consumed the city itself. Senators were forced to cheer when Sporus was paraded as empress. Nobles were compelled to offer their wives to the emperor's games. Soldiers guarded the chambers of humiliation, knowing that disobedience meant death. Even common people were dragged into the theater of shame. Nero's festivals included forced marriages, public displays of lust, and humiliations staged in the streets. The line between state and bedroom disappeared. Rome was no longer the capital of an empire. It was the brothel of one man's madness. For those who watched, survival meant complicity. Laughter became an act of self-defense, silence an act of rebellion. And so, the empire's elite clapped, cheered, and bowed, their dignity shattered, but their lives preserved. This was perhaps Nero's most horrific practice, not simply destroying bodies, but breaking spirits until cruelty itself became normal. Obsessions repeated themselves like broken notes in a song. The mother he killed, the wife he destroyed, the boy he mutilated, the people he mocked. Each act revealed the same cycle: desire, possession, destruction, and resurrection through cruelty. He could not create beauty without breaking it. He could not seek pleasure without demanding pain. And through it all, he demanded Rome applaud. Every humiliation was staged as a performance, every victim reduced to a role, every cry of pain drowned by forced laughter. His cruelty was not hidden but flaunted, paraded as proof that the emperor's power knew no limit. The horror was not only what he did, but that he made an empire watch. By the time Nero entered the final years of his reign, Rome was exhausted. The whispers, the spectacles, the humiliations, they had become unbearable. What had begun as shocking indulgences had swelled into daily horrors, staining the empire's dignity and corroding its stability. The emperor who once promised culture and harmony now seemed drunk on cruelty, incapable of separating desire from destruction. The marriage to Sporus was only the beginning. Nero forced the boy into the role of empress at public games, seating him in the imperial box, dressing him in jewels and silks that once belonged to Poppæa. Senators bowed, crowds clapped, but behind their eyes flickered terror. To Rome, Sporus was not merely a victim but a symbol, a daily reminder of the emperor's perversion, his mockery of family, marriage, and law. When rumors spread that Sporus had been paraded in mock ceremonies imitating the rites of imperial coronation, the outrage deepened. The young boy, mutilated and broken, had become the living ghost of Nero's madness. His humiliation was Rome's humiliation. But Nero did not stop there. He continued to stage his monstrous performances, appearing on stage as singer, dancer, even god. He forced senators to sit through hours of his art, daring anyone to leave before he was finished. It was not only sexual degradation now, it was a degradation of Rome itself, the empire reduced to audience for a madman. The climax of Nero's excess arrived with fire. In 64 CE, Rome burned for days, flames devouring homes, temples, and lives. Ancient accounts suggest Nero watched from his palace, singing of Troy's destruction while his people screamed below. Whether he caused the fire or not, the symbolism was damning. The city itself had become his stage, and its destruction, another act in his grotesque theater. Rumors spread that he had cleared space for a grand palace, the Domus Aurea, the golden house built upon the ashes of the poor. Its halls glittered with gold, fountains, and artificial lakes, but beneath the splendor lay the memory of thousands burned alive. For Romans, this was the breaking point. The man who turned boys into brides, women into spoils, and nobles into puppets had now reduced their city to ash. The conspiracies multiplied. Senators who once clapped for survival now whispered of rebellion. Generals, disgusted by his excesses, plotted his removal. The Praetorian Guard, once his shield, began to abandon him. Nero's name, once sung in poems, was now spat in disgust. As his enemies closed in, Nero tried to cling to performance. He continued to sing on stage, demanding applause from dwindling crowds. He sought comfort in Sporus, forcing the boy to remain at his side, as if the presence of his bride could shield him from rebellion. But love was not what bound them, fear was. Sporus was no partner, only the last reminder of Nero's obsession with possession and control. When the Senate declared him a public enemy, Nero fled in panic. The emperor who once terrorized the city with his cruelty now cowered in gardens, hiding from his own guards. Abandoned by allies, stripped of power, he was reduced to a fugitive. In the end, Nero's death carried the same irony as his life. Cornered, trembling, he begged his companions to kill him. None dared. Finally, with soldiers closing in, he took his own life, or, as some sources claim, forced a servant to strike the blow. His last words were infamous: "Qualis artifex perio," what an artist dies in me. The emperor who once mutilated a boy to create a bride, who played beast and god in his private chambers, who burned a city while singing of glory, died not as a god, but as a coward. His fantasies had crumbled. His empire had turned, and history sealed him as the very image of insanity. Perhaps the cruelest twist of all was Sporus's fate. After Nero's death, Sporus was passed from one powerful man to another, still dressed as an empress, still humiliated. The boy who had been turned into a living symbol of Nero's madness could never escape it. Some years later, when threatened with being paraded as a woman once more, Sporus took his own life. Even in freedom, he remained Nero's prisoner. Thus, Nero's legacy was not only in ashes and gold, but in the broken lives he left behind. Victims like Sporus bore the weight of his obsessions long after the emperor himself was gone. And Rome, scarred by humiliation, could never wash away the memory of its most infamous ruler. Nero's reign ended in ashes, but his shadow never left Rome. For centuries, his name has been whispered as a curse, a symbol of power unchained from humanity. The most horrific sexual practices of Nero the Insane were not only personal perversions, they were weapons of domination, staged to remind an empire that no one, not even the innocent, could escape the reach of one man's will. His story forces us to confront a chilling truth: cruelty does not thrive in darkness alone. It survives when societies applaud, when silence becomes safer than resistance, when entire cities play along with the fantasies of the powerful. Rome's senators laughed when Nero demanded it. Rome's crowds clapped when Sporus was paraded, and by that laughter and clapping, shame became law. But history has a way of cutting through silence. Nero's empire of humiliation collapsed, yet his victims, Sporus, Poppaea, and the countless unnamed, remain immortal in the memory of suffering. Their stories remind us that beneath marble palaces and golden halls, it is the human body, fragile and sacred, that often pays the highest price for power. And centuries later, we are still haunted, not by Nero's art, but by his cruelty.